Thanks, Lynn. All right, thank you guys, and thank you, Lynn, for that amazing introduction. Made me feel very nice. So today I'm going to talk about the Argentine PES program and deforestation in Chaco. Should I use this as a pointer? Yeah. And I will try not to move too much because I remember now there's a camera, and the last time I was here I walked around the room and that didn't work out too well. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of what I'd like to talk about today is I'd like to tell you a little bit about what were my motivations for working in the Chaco, and I'm going to cover some of the work that I did with Lynn very briefly, just to set the stage of what got me moving into new directions. And then I'm going to tell you about a market-based strategy for environmental conservation and thinking about this PES program in Argentina and agriculturally driven deforestation. And then talk about interactions between this program and wildlife and future direction. And so I see this, and not only is it naturally the roadmap of today's talk, but also you could think of this as sort of a gradient between where my disciplinary training is and sort of where I'm moving away from my comfort zone, but also where the most interesting stuff is. And so it's just that. And to talk about the motivation of this, I like this picture because it represents many things. So this is the soybean-powered public transport system. I think that this embodies perfectly this very difficult task that is combining economic growth with increased human population. But at the same time, we want to conserve biodiversity and achieve all these multiple goals. But doing that task is not an easy thing to do. And I started realizing this early on after I graduated, when I started working at the Ministry of Environment, looking at how deforestation in the Chaco was happening, mainly because of expansion of industrial ag. And it was getting some headlines back then. And so I thought, well, you know, this is an interesting opportunity to research, because one other thing that happens when deforestation occurs is that these linear strips of primary forest are left in the field. And so if you see a satellite image from above, you see all the ag parcels that are perfectly subdivided with linear fragments. And the reason why this started happening was to prevent soil and wind erosion, right? But then as news of deforestation started to emerge and the case started being more notorious, then the Ministry of Environment and other folks started saying that this actually helped preserve the community of mammals. So mammals actually use these strips to connect different patches of forest. But it's really good because that's a very testable hypothesis that I can do, and then I will find out what's going on there. I will inform policy. It'll be good. So, and this is really important because there are also indigenous communities that live from that forest and are being affected by it. Not only because, so it's not that their lands get deforested, their lands remain intact, but the land that surrounds these areas start to have less and less forest, and therefore support less and less mammals and other critters that they use to sustain their livelihoods. So that's what I did. I went to the field. I did a camera trap survey, sampling a whole bunch of these forest versus strips to see how mammals change in terms of occupancy along this distance. I did some very nice Bayesian models that I learned, and took a long time to learn, but I enjoyed doing it. And I had my data, I learned that some mammals decreased in terms of from going from continuous forest to forest strips. Others increased, and some of those associations were significant and some were not, which is denoted by the solid line punctuated. So I thought, okay, this is fantastic. Now I have real data. I'm gonna publish it. So we did. Helped with a lot of people. I presented a report to the Ministry of Environment, and they said, okay, that's great, but well, what do you do? Oh, okay. So that was my first shock. I was hoping that that now they have information, that they sort of the forest, and so I talked to the agricultural producers and told them, hey, you know what? Actually, when deforestation is happening, this is how mammals are responding. And then I had a very eye-opening experience, and it was that they told me, you know, this is fine, Mal, but if I conserve this forest, then, as you say, the benefit falls on the entire society. But who bears the cost? I bear the cost. So I thought, you know, that's a very good point to make. I mean, I completely understood this point of view. And I was a little bit frustrated that this couldn't translate immediately to policy, right? And my assumption was that the users were not aware of the impact. And I thought that if they knew, then they would do things different, right? Now that, of course, didn't happen. But the good thing is that in 2007, the Argentine government created a policy instrument that allowed people that had forests to conserve these forests. So it gave them incentives, monetary incentives, which I thought, well, this might actually do the trick, thinking about that conversation that I had with some of the landowners that they were bearing the cost of conserving. I thought this might do it. And this program is quite interesting because it tackles one of the main drivers of deforestation, which is expansion of industrial agriculture. And this image is not great, but it does show the point that if you look at overall forest loss, which are areas in red, you know, different parts of the world light up. But if you look at the Chaco, they're very bright areas. And so this contextualized the fact that it wasn't just the people from the Chaco that were saying, you know, these are locally important deforestation rates. This was a global problem. And suddenly the Chaco was in the, like, not sure how to say it, but it was very noticeable. And so when the government passed a law, they aimed to use a program that would help, whose objectives were to conserve for environmental protection and for enrichment, restoration, conservation, and sustainable management of native forests and the environmental services they provide. So, after they passed the law, they also required that each province went through a land use zoning process in which they, according to the law, they had to organize all their native forests into three categories: red, yellow, and green. And the enrollment in this program was voluntary. And the main requisites to this program was to have native forests and to have land, or other conditions that were the main requisites. The other thing that's worth noticing is that once they did the land use zoning, the different categories corresponds to areas that vary in terms of how important they are for conservation, right? So it's assumed that red areas are more important than yellow areas, and yellow areas are more important than green areas. However, since Argentina is it's a federal country, each province has a certain level of autonomy, and so each province did their land use zoning process following their own methodologies. And so it's interesting because you see some discrepancy along the border lines. For example, Formosa says, well, this area is really not too important. Oh, wait a minute. On the Salta side, it's actually a little bit more important, or some other areas that are super highly important for conservation, they suddenly stop being after border lines. So that's another interesting aspect of this program. And this is important. The length of enrollment is defined at the time. So if I'm a landowner and want to submit my land into this program, then I will sign a contract that states for how long will I enroll. 1 year, 10 years, it could be 20 years. And also for each program, there are different types of enrollment. So you can enroll your land to do strictly conservation-related activities, or you could do sustainable development. Now, it's worth noticing that in red areas, you can only do conservation activities. You can't do sustainable development activities because it's the land use type with the highest restriction. Yellow is intermediate in terms of conservation priorities and also land restriction. You cannot deforest, but you can do both conservation plans and sustainable. In green areas, you can do conservation plans and sustainable development plans, but you can also submit a request to the forest. And the payments per hectare in red are greater than yellow and greater than, this is to attract participants into the most important areas. Yes, Marcel. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a minimum time? And they say 1 or 6 months?
That's a great question. No, there isn't. And I'm actually gonna have some results to talk about that issue. Bring a very good point. And some of the issues that people that really know about these programs talk about in the literature is that funds are allocated to places sometimes with low deforestation risks. And what does this mean? This means that sometimes the program is actually investing money in places that would not be deforested in the absence of the program. This is what some economists talk about adverse effects. And then the other thing is that some are worried that the program, even though it's functioning, it doesn't necessarily achieve its goals. In this case, in terms of decreasing deforestation. And so for my last chapter of my dissertation, I asked the question of, does this program achieve long-term enrollment of lands with higher agricultural suitability? So I wanted to see how did the land that was enrolled compare with the land that did not enroll in terms of access. So in a sense, I took agricultural suitability as a proxy of deforestation pressure, assuming, of course, and this is a big assumption, that land with higher agricultural suitability is a greater risk of deforestation. And also, I wanted to know if the implementation of the program would reduce deforestation rates. Now, it's also worth clarifying that in this program, there are two main aspects. One is the payment aspect of it, and the other one is the restriction. Very different zones, okay? And so to see how the suitability of land for agriculture varied in different parts, I had access to an amazing data set that had absolutely all program participants. It was given to me by the Ministry of Environment. And that data set, I really like it because of the amount of information. So it has not only the location of program participants, but how much land they allocate into the program, how much money are they giving, and also their tax identification. And this will be a little bit more interesting in the talk. And so I combined those locations that did participate in the program with random non-participation. So I could compare the ag suitability of those spots, those locations that participate with the locations that did not participate. And then with helps of generalized linear models, I tested that empirically. But also what you were talking about, honestly, like one thing is people that enroll, but people that enroll do not enroll for the same amount of time, right? So this can be this can change drastically the length of enrollment and the where. And to look at the question of if pests reduce deforestation, I looked at land cover data. So I took data from the year 2000, 2007, and 2014. Why these years? Well, so the law was passed in 2007. So I wanted to compare it with deforestation the 7 years before the law and 7 years after. But after, compare how the deforestation trends changed. And also I wanted to see how deforestation was linked with agricultural suitability. And so I tested this again with a generalized linear mix model, testing the different zones, so red, yellow, and green, before and after the law, and the different types of agricultural suitabilities. In terms of enrollment, the data shows that in the past 5 years, there was a $45 million investment. And PES seems to have achieved enrollment in both lands with good agricultural suitability, with higher agricultural suitability, and lower. So in that sense, it signifies that this program may actually be attracting lands that are at high risk of deforestation. However, when we looked at the length of them, we realized that people that enroll in high agricultural suitability, they were doing it for a much shorter period of time. So this is really interesting. That problem that Ferraro, the economist, was talking about in terms of adverse selection, we're not noticing it in terms of where they enroll, but for how long. This is very important, because if people are enrolling for short periods, their land under high deforestation, they may just be doing it until market conditions good, and so for a year they chop it all off and get money from the government. So this is very important to know and understand. And also in terms of deforestation, sadly, whoa, great, okay. Sorry about that. Deforestation increased. After the forest law, it increased much more than 7 years before the forest law. However, where deforestation was happening would give me an indication that it might be working. And so when I plotted the results of my models and I compared deforestation in yellow, green, and red areas before and after the law, before and after, I can see that the probabilities of deforestation were higher both before than after the law, and specifically in areas in red. However, there are a few issues with this analysis, and mainly is the fact that to do this very thoroughly, literature and program evaluation suggests that you should do matching of lands. So, and for that, you need the cadastral information. So the individual boundaries of each landholding, which I didn't have. And also the fact that there's another issue that in red areas, there are protected areas that can't be in this program, which at first it may be counterintuitive, because you may ask, well, why are protected areas being enrolled? But some of those protected areas may need more funding to secure those conservation goals, so they enroll, and the law allows them to. However, the amount of protected area that we have in this landscape is less than 30% or 20%, which is unlikely to be driving, which is why it's unlikely to be driving these entire patterns. But there's one thing I was convinced that I needed further understanding of this problem. I felt like I was just looking at the tip of the iceberg, and underneath the water there was a whole bunch of new trends and things happening that I needed to understand. So I'd like to move forward in terms of using better ways of evaluating the effects of the program, and ask the question of, well, what about wildlife, and also what about people, right? And so one thing that I would like to do is add land use information from Paraguay. Now, Paraguay is also one of the countries that hold a lot of the Chaco forest. And so, but unlike Argentina, Paraguay did not have this payment for consistent service program. So it could be an interesting case where we don't have the program working. And also now I have the cadastral information. Actually, some of you know I was in Argentina not too long ago, and I finally got the cadastral data for all of the Chaco province, the Chaco ecoregion, the 4 provinces. This is really amazing, and you can see the different patterns of land tenure. I mean, you have some provinces like Salta and Santiago del Estero, which have enormous land holdings, but then you have some other provinces like Formosa and Chaco that have much, much smaller, much more uniform land holdings, and some areas here, for example, we don't even have information who that land belongs to. It's completely different scenarios. This is another reason why I find this program so interesting. It's because in the one same ecoregion, you have different socio-economical, environmental realities that make it such an interesting case study. How am I doing this? Yeah. Oh, okay. And I'm also very interested in knowing how does this program, how do the people that participate in this program support areas of high wildlife importance. And the assumption here is that when the government says we will pay a given amount of dollar per unit land, they're assuming that a hectare forest count equals a hectare for wildlife, right? But that may not be the case. Thank you, Lynn, so much for that. I stole that from one of Lynn's, of course. But it shows a very important case, and that is that, for example, if we take a hectare in a forest patch that is disconnected, that may not be the same as a hectare in a much larger patch that is connected. And also within each of these zones, the occupancy of mammals, so the amount of mammals that might be roaming around might be completely different, and also the amount of species that might be harbored in these patches could be completely different. And this spatial aspect of this program in terms of wildlife and forest connectivity is largely overlooked. And so I'd like to test that. Fortunately, I have some data on species occurrence from my master's work, which I'm planning to combine it with a data set from a collaborator who has been working in the other provinces of the Chaco that I did over. So it's a fantastic opportunity to join those two data sets and look at species distribution modeling to try to tackle this question. And this is tremendously important, especially for large body mammals like the giant anteater. And when we think about this question that 1 hectare in a given forest patch is not the same in different parts of the landscape, fortunately, the National Parks Agency has started working on a corridor initiative where they're looking to connect the main protected areas and parts that they consider that are important for conservation and connect them with corridors. So again, this gives me a tremendous opportunity to test empirically how the locations correspond to these places that are important for connectivity of families. And this is not something that just happened in 2013. This problem is still important and it's still making news. This article came out, well, it's a letter in Science that came out just a few weeks ago. So it's a very important issue, but also I think that this program represents one of the sort of best case scenarios, considering the amount of money that the government has invested in this program, but also the expected investment in the next 5 years. So the World Bank is planning to allocate over $70 million on this program, which is similar in terms of amount of investment and continuity as other programs like in Ecuador or the PES program in China. And also, I'd like to interact with people that are much more competent in this than I am and explore some poverty alleviations in biodiversity conservation. So for example, one thing that we noticed just doing some back of the envelope type of calculations is that if you look at the participants that are enrolled, 4% of those participants are currently getting 37% of all funding. So you can think of that as wow, there's a lot of concentration of that resource. But then the flip side of that is that same 4% of participants are enrolling 70% of the land. So this is very interesting because on the one hand you have the concentration of resources argument, but on the other hand you have an argument that focuses on, well, what would I need to do if I wanted to attract the most amount of land to this program? And also I'm interested in comparison different impact evaluation methods. And I think I'm now in a position to do this where I can compare a matching way of comparing this program versus a before and after, versus applying some markup models. And I want to show you some preliminary findings. Now this is just around 40% of the data. And what this data is, remember that I told you that the government provides a list of all program participants and have the tax identification number. I just thought, oh, that's some useless piece of information. I'm not the Argentine IRS, so there's nothing to do with that. But fortunately, my wife was much, much smarter than me and worked at a bank. She said, Mal, there's actually this online database where you can just plug in the tax identification number. You can see who they are and what is their main economic activity. I thought, well, wait a minute. You're telling me that for all program participants, I could see exactly what they're doing? Because that's amazing in terms of understanding who is getting that money, right? And it's a way where I can at least begin to understand this process instead of going to the field and trying to ask, hey, Siva, so what do you do for a living? And all that kind of stuff. And so I'm very excited for this. And one of the things that we're finding is that there's a 60-40 split in terms of the person type. Now I put this in Spanish because I have no idea how to say it in English. So you can think of this as personas físicas, as actual human beings, okay? And personas jurídicas are not human beings, but could be a group. So it could be, say, civil society or a club or a corporation. So it's more than a corporation. It could be a corporation. It could be a group of indigenous people. It can be an association of small landowners. It can be, so it's very broad. As long as more than a few people get together and they get this thing of personería jurídica, then that's it. Now, I saw this and I thought, this is interesting, but it doesn't say too much. But then I looked at when I looked at the gender, and also I apologize for using gender. I wasn't really sure whether to use gender or what's the appropriate word. But this is really interesting. I mean, 83% are males and only 17% are females. Now, I'm not saying that this is a reflection of the program. I think the program is merely sampling happening in the society of the northern Argentina, which is just a step forward feudalism. But also, if you look at the main economic activity, I like to focus your attention on this part. You could see that the main economic activity, for example, is real estate, association services, cattle, public services. So this is very interesting because, and again, I did this morning because I just got this data set, and so this data set still needs to be cleaned a lot. There's a lot of categories that can be lumped together. But I was too excited not to show this slide, even though it's kind of ugly, but still. I was not expecting the real estate was the main occupation of some of these program participants. So why is that? I have no idea. Or there was another servicios jurídicos. So these are law firms that for some reason own that and they enroll in this program. So they're a very important actor. And I think, again, we're now just beginning to understand what's happening at a level. Yeah. Also, I'm very fortunate because Christina, my wife, is going to actually go to and do a lot of cool social science and understand this program much, much better. So I'm very, very happy to be collaborating with her and, of course, with them and other people. But also, I told you that I'm interested in these Markov models. And these models are interesting, and I promise this won't be short. I'm not going to get mathy, but you're basically thinking that each of those pieces of land can go from forested to deforested at a given rate, right? And the trick is to try to explain what goes on in that rate that changes from forest to deforested. And in this project, I'm collaborating with my nephew. It all stays in the family. He is a PhD candidate in the Department of Math. Incredibly bright person. And with his help, he's been able to incorporate the variability of stock prices and agricultural commodities using Brownian motion that follows the stocks very, very well, which is what they use to try to predict the Wall Street stuff. And so that is built into this model. This helps us play around with different scenarios and see what would happen with probabilities of deforestation or probabilities of staying forest at different values of pests, at different values of monetary allocation per unit land in lands that are of low ag suitability, intermediate ag suitability, and high ag suitability. Again, this is just to show you some simulations, but I think it's a very useful framework to just do that, ask questions of what would happen, play around with these variables. And so with that, it's just the acknowledgement, of course, the University of Florida, and my eternal gratitude towards my advisor, committee members, faculty, students, local partners, INTA, and of course, my full-wife postdoctoral fellowship, which currently supports my work. And of course, TC and the School of Natural Resources. Thank you very much. Now,